great to be with you once again. Welcome to the show, Time for Africa. Over the past year, we've had incredible guests who've shared their messages with us, their insights on Africa. And last week, we took a look at the most inspirational messages. This week, we want to take a look at the critical issues, the priorities that we must focus on as a continent. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gishuru. What are the critical issues for the African continent today? Some might argue governance is the most important. Others would say it starts with security. Corruption, many people say, but what do you think? Well, our guests have had a lot to say over the past year, and we want to revisit some of the most important points that have been raised, even as we plan for a greater future for the African continent. Let's go straight to some of the incredible insights we've heard over the past year.
Nkrumah said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom." After independence, it was seek ye first your own benefits. We are not criticizing the first generation of leaders or the first generation of the elites, but there were sins of omission and commission that we committed in mismanaging our diversity. So political competition and economic competition has been at the root of all the conflicts across the board. Whether you begin from the Congo crisis, it is Sudan, or it is Liberia, it is because of the diversities that have been manifested in conflicts because of exclusion. So in addressing diversity in Africa, we must begin by finding ways and means of restoring or correcting that exclusion, both in political terms and in economic terms.
There has been a massive change in terms of the continent over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly the last 10 years. But still, there is a lot of neglect, a lot of kind of denial of basic dignity and basic rights to essential services. You know, 1 in 16 women still die at childbirth. 2 out of 5 men and women die from infectious diseases. 1 in 3 children across the continent are out of school. These are really the, I guess what you'd call the drivers of the insecurity that we're seeing at the moment. So that's the first point. The development growth, the growth of development has to accelerate to be able to leave people vested in the idea of a nation state and its economy. That's the first point. Second point is that in the conversation, and we start to see this a little more, and it's very popular within the East African region, that we have to trade rapid economic growth and infrastructural growth for democratic freedoms and rights. So it started with the late Prime Minister Meles, who argued basically that, you know, an autocratic or a firm, benevolent dictator would actually create the conditions under which we would enjoy, you know, freedoms and human rights 10 years from now. I think that's a false argument, and I think it's a very dangerous argument because we don't necessarily have to trade one for the other. We can have both.
My message is for the African leadership to recognize it's not their law and it's not their power, it's our power and our law. And to come down to the people that they serve and find out what they can do for the people. Dialogue, and remember before you are a leader, remember a time before when you were a child and playing games with the same people who you are now governing over. I think the moment you take that back, you might realize that it's not about the leadership you have today, it's about the leadership that you will leave for your children or your grandchildren tomorrow.
I think that we first acknowledge that in the last 20 years that the African continent has made significant progress in terms of democracy. Leave aside economic growth or anything else, and we have less dictatorships, more democratic institutions, more reform. So that is very positive. And what we are saying is, whatever other challenges are there now, we don't want to lose that democratic space that we've already got, because the way to progress is still freedom. Freedom and rights is the way definitely to make progress. So if you have these scares, we don't want that used as a general excuse to deny public rights.
Yeah, I think for me, the African leadership needs to move beyond the rule of fear. After September 11 and with the ongoing threats of security and economic anxiety sometimes, there's been a resurgence of rule of fear, which I think would undermine and delete the democratic gains that have been made. So it is useful that in this era of anxiety, there should be more return to democracy rather than more return to excessiveness and coercion as a way of leadership. And to the citizens, I think, having been in South Africa at the time when xenophobia sort of took root and saw a lot of Africans standing against their fellow Africans, we have to look for a new model of claiming our citizenship. Citizenship now can't be claimed on basis of ethnicity or basis of identity frameworks that exclude others, but perhaps more on the framework of rights. If you claim citizenship on the framework of rights, you tend to be more inclusive, you tend to be more attentive to the rights of others, and you tend to create a model of thinking and living that allows belonging for all, other than belonging for a few and exclusion of many.
I think what governments need to do, and working with the communities, is to find a fair balance. Because in agriculture, the land that is being utilized, I will tell you, is unutilized land. Is arable, unutilized. And even if you leave it for the next 1,000 years, it will never be utilized because the people do not have the wherewithal to expand their production, their productivity levels. But then, where you are displacing a given population, you need to have a proper settlement program. You need to provide, either you do social safety nets, but you need to provide some sort of alternative sources of income.
I believe that if we can enforce these, laws and strengthen the judiciaries and strengthen criminal justice, so that people who abuse the rights of men and women and children and girls are, brought to justice.
We need to make sure that we are relatively egalitarian because the levels of inequality are too high. So we absolutely need to reduce inequality, because if we don't reduce inequality, social inequality, we might face governance issues and issues related to political instability.
This empowerment of girls seem to communicate the opposite to men, that these people are out to finish us. And unfortunately, that has resulted in a lot of violence of all kinds and at all levels, starting in the family. For me, I'd say, from my perspective, it is to understand for men, women, boys, and girls, what is the role of each in the society, in the family, in the community? What is the role? Because those roles have been predefined. They are there. The roles exist. There's enough power for men, for women, for boys and girls. If only we would help every man and every woman to understand that, then I think we can start to kind of reload, to reboot, and to, we say reloaded, families reloaded, where men actually now realize that the empowerment of women does not mean the disempowerment of men. It means that now we have stronger women for a better society. Yeah.
I'm looking at legislation, not just to reset the social balance, but to create dividends of this balance that helps Africa to use all its energy, to use all its talent, to use all its capability. And so the challenge is actually us, who are reshaping the agenda today, who are setting the goals for the future, not to replicate, to create a new situation of imbalance. And that's why you see that on the continent we are experiencing more gender-based violence, because the men have been displaced in some spaces and they just don't know how to navigate a place where they don't have opportunity, a place where they don't have advantage. And so that creates another problem. I think we have the knowledge, we have the foresight to make the right balance and therefore use the space we are in today not to create new gender imbalances.
I think what's really interesting is, and let me just quote something real quick, the only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary, for us English speakers, that is. And I think this is something we really need to look at. You know, we look at women leaders, you know, but the question mark is their impact. I don't think you need to stand up and throw chairs around or burn your bra to have an impact. I think it's the influence that you have, the kind of people that you influence, the kind of people that you bring in. Because let me just say this, there's a very big difference between being a leader and being a representative. And I think here's where we women differ. We are emotionally intelligent. We need to recognize the fact that we don't have to be a man to make a difference. This is a world in which women, if we want to be equal, stand up and show what our strengths are. And I think that is pretty much where we fail as leaders, because we've tried in many instances, and I say this with due respect, to be men. If it hasn't worked for them, why do we want to reinvent something that didn't work in the first place?
I would recommend and call upon the private sector, government, different stakeholders to support women, to add value to what they're producing so that they can compete effectively within the East African market. Because unless they have goods that actually are to the standard, however much we talk, however much we have the rhetoric, we shall never see them there participating effectively. And maybe also to that, I would call upon the partner states to make sure that they pass the East African Protocol on Gender Equality and Development.
One of the ways in which you can actually encourage small or black-led businesses or female-led businesses or whatever is to actually impose a requirement on main contractors to put them into their subcontractors.
Absolutely.
And if then, you know, the government procurement office is kind of used to dealing with the usual suspects, then require the usual suspects to bring them in.
To have diversity in their own.
Because that's how it kind of works with us, you know, as lawyers, when we bid for, you know, major contracts, we have to bring the right people into the team.
I think we need a regional policy to define how partner states are going to support business women to participate more effectively in intra-EAC trade. The process of developing that policy has begun, but we need to fast track and ensure that that policy is in place as soon as possible.
For the young women and young people out there, I'll tell you, there's no nice way to say this. It's your job to go out and find your mentors. There's no other way. That's what we've all done. And I say that with the deepest compassion and with the deepest sympathy for what that means. It's writing lots of emails. It's getting good at writing. I read Google how to write an email to busy people. You know, when I need to write an email to the CEO of a very big company, I still do that. So you really need to go out of your way. And I guarantee you, once you do that, you will be amazed at the response. If I may speak for some of the women, what we're finding is a very lackadaisical, hey, can you help me? And I'm thinking, if I help you, I'm not going home to spend time with my 4-year-old. I'm not working on a contract that I need to work for my business. So show me you're worth my investment in time. So that's what you just need to show us. And once you show that, you're not going to have a shortage.
People often talk about the youth and the need to address the youth, but it's true that when you look at in refugee camps, you see the high percentage of youth that are there. Lots of frustration on their part. And I would say that's definitely, if not, it's definitely a concern that one sees. And I would say at the end of the day, if you say,
has anybody been let down? I think it's the youth. And if there is a place where more attention needs to be given, it is to the youth, to make sure that at least they can get the education that they require, and that they then can access to an environment where they can grow.
I think I really have been saying, and I will say it again, that Africa really needs to treasure its people, the young people, to invest in the people. So if Africa is a continent with a young population. That young population could be a huge resource. It could be also a risk if you leave all this large number of people, young people, unemployed also. So I think investment in people is very critical also, and to value the people, to invest in education and so on, and to retain the educated people.
The most important thing, I think, is save resources. I think utilization, proper saving and utilization of resources, and then use the skills that we all have. Everybody has talents, and use the talents that you have in utilizing the resources that you have available. It might be that you are good at working hard. It might be that you have some money. It might be that you are very talented in certain fields. But utilizing these resources for the benefit of your country, this is what we should all do.
I really do believe that if we really want the international world to take Africa seriously, we need to take ourselves seriously. We need to up the game as Africans. We are capable, but we also need to recognize that Africa Rising is not just about giving Africans opportunities. It's about African driving the reputation of the leadership in Africa to be able to deliver at all standards, at local standards and international standards, but with credibility that builds the reputation of Africa.
We're taking a break now, but don't go away. Much more still coming up on the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Welcome back to the show. We're looking at priority issues for Africa as highlighted by our guests over the past year. Let's go straight to their views.
I strongly believe in the entrepreneurial culture in Africa. And I believe with the right policy, the right political will and environment, with the right kind of match, with the right kind of assistance, you can truly unlock Africa's potential. When we talk about transforming Africa, I believe the best kind of aid to Africa is aid for trade. One that make it cheaper and more efficient to trade. And then I think then the business environment would take, the elements of the business environment would take place, and you will see innovation and you will see growth that is equitable.
The most important thing for the leadership is you have to believe in your own projects. And to believe in your own projects means you have to make sure the resources are available, you have to make sure cut off some of too much of the bureaucracy, and just make sure our projects come to fruition.
Yeah, I also believe that service delivery has to go along with the growth that we're experiencing. And that if we do not step up service delivery, we'll have more and more recriminations, more and more inequality. But that has to come with accountability mechanisms. For me, missing in the whole equation is proper accountability mechanisms that bite. And I think we need to focus on that and talk more about how to hold ourselves accountable, or have our citizens hold us accountable. Finally, I think that a government needs to be upfront and admit if you cannot deliver certain services and the private sector can deliver it better than you. There's nothing wrong in saying, let us recruit or hire the private sector if they can deliver better, or even let them do all the delivery and somehow get paid for it or run the service.
One thing I think we've really learned is that just by investing in infrastructure alone doesn't pay. It's when you invest in infrastructure with policy that pays. And when you build a border post and you bring in systems change and different ways of doing things, then you get really big impact. And I think it's important. I thought it was...
We are seeing almost every second or third month the news of a rebasing of an African economy. It turns out African economies are much larger than we had been able to measure before, and the news is generally good. It seems to be the new fashion in Africa. Africa's bigger, it's growing faster. It's good news. We have seen this outperformance in the region compared to global growth for about a decade and a half now. And the exciting thing is that for many people looking at the African region, for Africans themselves, it looks as though we're finally getting the kind of growth trajectory in Africa that has been needed all along.
If we are really serious about developing our continent, we need to walk our talk, and we need to put something on the table. But it's not only the government, also other partners, civil society organizations, private sectors, all stakeholders in a country should work hand in hand and develop the health and education of that country.
I think I will say that every person, regardless of your background, regardless of what level socioeconomic status, has access to good diagnostic and treatment and whatever kind preventive, promotive service, health service that is there.
What I think the answer is the following, and we at Excelsior actually believe that very much. You cannot ignore the three parts or three actors within a health system, frankly within any public system or any institution, if you will. The public sector has a role to play. I think the social sector, NGOs, donors have a role to play. And I think the private sector has a role to play. And in fact, if we can define these roles in very specific and coordinated manners, you will see an ecosystem that then thrives and actually develops the healthcare sector. So I think, just to summarize, public sector, I think their role is basically basic sanitation, water, immunization, all the primary care and public health stuff. That's where the government should focus on. Private sector should focus on providing services in a way that is accessible, affordable, and the highest quality, and perhaps to sometimes a different segment. Social sector, in my view, should fill in the gaps, right? So we had an HIV pandemic, we have a malaria pandemic, we have a TB. Come in, help us fill in those gaps. But let's do all these three, have all these three actors work in a coordinated fashion. And if we do that, I think we have a chance to have an ecosystem that then thrives and develops healthcare on the continent.
Look, our young people, many of them finish from school, and they are job hunters. They're looking for jobs all the time, when they should be job creators. And so in Nigeria, we've decided to create a new generation of young commercial farmers. We're going to do 750,000 young commercial farmers and agribusiness entrepreneurs over 5 years. It is crucial for us. It's crucial for Kenya. It's crucial for every country to do that, because our farmers, they are too old. If we don't change that now, in 20 years, there'll be no farmers left in Africa.
My vision for Africa is that, you see, when I started talking about agriculture as a business and the need for smallholder farmers to receive minimum attention, people laughed at me. He's romanticizing this. Today, I'm happy to say that in most conferences like this, people use the same language. So it's beginning to seep in. And I'm happy to say that we have a few countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, Ghana, Malawi to some extent, Ethiopia for sure, are beginning to serve as evidence that this can work. Now, what is intriguing, exciting about all of these countries I've mentioned, they are not wealthy in terms of mineral resources or oil, at least so far. If Ethiopia in particular has been able to achieve what it has achieved in the last 15 to 20 years, based on sound agricultural policies, based on strong leadership, based on macroeconomic policies and investment in infrastructure, then I believe the future will be on countries and leaders of countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, and the rest of them.
It is important to know that agricultural development is actually a private enterprise. When you involve the private sector is there to stay. And if you have right policies and good leadership, you have much more chances of sustaining successes. And we can say that the investment that we have seen that are being done by the private sector in Tanzania, particularly in the Sagot area, these ones are actually going on year after year. And now we are perfecting that process. Therefore, it is very, very important. And that comes a question of prioritization.
Right.
Listen to the private sector.
I think it is a sense of partnership, recognizing that it's not one sector or one type of organization that drives development. It is both the public sector, the private sector, and civil society working together that can contribute to make change happen.
RAD in agriculture must perform better and give better returns than RAD allocated for golfing, RAD allocated for tourism, and RAD allocated for real estate. If agriculture is to attract the skilled human labor, youthful population in Africa, then it must give a fair return and compensate and remunerate those in agriculture better than other sectors. So for me, the way to transform agriculture is to make it a high-value sector, such that it generates enormous value. Growing beans and growing grains alone is not sufficient to transform agriculture. Relying on rain-fed irrigation farming is not going to be sufficient, irrespective of what we do. There are no policies that will skew markets to be able to transform agriculture. It is agriculture that needs to transform itself to be a competitive sector so that it attracts all the factors of production.
I think we realize that we need to have the right inputs. By inputs, I mean the right seeds, the fertilizer required, amount of water, irrigation, and try to get more crop per drop. And because for years we were using seeds which were 20, 25 years old, whereas in other countries there's constant research with the end result that the yield of African farmers, mainly women who work very hard, was about a third of the global average. With better seed varieties, they are also increasing their production. And if we can help them market it, if we can help them warehouse it, and have commodities exchanges where they can really place their produce, we will make quite a lot of progress. Where we have problems is sometimes land tenure. Land tenure, land laws, and how you use land, and the litigation that surrounds land, which sometimes makes it difficult for people to come in, acquire land.
There's still work to do in making sure that Africa's agricultural growth, it doesn't just respond to what we're told by others we need, but that we are, as Africans, are responding to the needs we know we have, right? And that's where having African scientists and building the capacity of African scientists to come up with varieties that are locally relevant is critical.
Varieties and models as well.
And ways of doing things, policies that are locally relevant. We can't afford to ignore that piece of the puzzle if we're truly going to scale production and be able to feed ourselves.
You want to make progress in terms of defeating poverty on the continent, because we don't want our people to be hungry and poor and uneducated and so on. No access to health services and so on. Can we do more? Yes, if we can do less, let's do more. We want a continent that's at peace. What is this fighting in Somalia and South Sudan and you know all these conflicts? Boko Haram in Nigeria, where all of us concerned, these are not just the Somali problem, it's the African problems. What kind of Africa do we want? Both for our own nationals and for the larger community of Africans. I'm saying the aspirations will be the same. And to the extent that we have not achieved these goals of the eradication of poverty, of gender equality, and so on, there's work to be done.
I disagree that development aid is a form of corruption. I think, as we were talking, our own resources and resources from outside can be appropriately used transparently and for the purposes for which they were given. So corruption is a regrettable phenomenon because it does undermine and steals and undermines development and undermines confidence and deprives the ordinary people or the majority of the benefits they would otherwise receive. So when there is corruption, then, or to the extent that there may be corruption, to that extent the people are denied of what is rightly theirs. And I don't think that has anything to do with whether the resources are from outside or not.
Once we have established where the resources are, what they are, and what the markets are like, then you must get on to the population to agree on ownership. Otherwise, even if you had very good laws and they came in, there would arise new contests from the local population about ownership. I think you have to agree with all the people about how to share that ownership. Once you have that in place, then you can bring legislation, you can seek partnerships. But even when you have external partners, I think it's important to involve local or nationals in this production process and in this marketing process, so that the benefits can flow to both the external as well as the local investors, because even their goodwill is an investment in the enterprises. That is where it needs to be. That's what I meant by saying it must start with the people.
I believe, as President Buhari said, because I was there, we had less than we had now in terms of
capacity,
people to help. But we had leadership that is committed and focused. Leadership that is committed and focused. And in those days, in the 70s, in the 1970s, if you wanted to get things done in Africa, in East Africa, you probably would go into two places, essentially. In West Africa, maybe into 2 or 3. In North Africa, maybe into 2, maybe 3. And you get it done. So you have what I call the core leadership team, to put it that way, in the 70s that will drive Africa, whether it's for policy making or for policy implementation, and the backup in terms of collaborators and civil public servants was not as strong. And the availability of information was also not as abundant.
Yeah, I really think one of the most important developments in Africa in recent years was the rise of civil society. Because civil society at the end is what's going to keep the government honest, frankly. Yes, it's great if you have wonderful leaders in some countries, but civil society is so important to keep people really honest and enforce accountability.
First, We as Africans must realize that at the basis, at the root of our problems is a crippling lack of self-confidence. And that lack of self-confidence comes from the idea that to improve and to develop is to become someone that you are not. And so Africans should realize that modernization and development is not westernization, that there are forms of modernization and development that can be grown here, that have been grown here, and that you can look to.
Fascinating insights. And there we've ended with the 4 wise men, is what they are being called. Former African presidents now contributing to conversations and to initiatives to uplift the African continent. We end with a powerful proverb. When the leg does not walk, the stomach does not eat. This is a Congolese proverb. It speaks for itself. Let's walk so that we can eat. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.